and I'm looking 30 years ahead.
Okay.
I don't expect this to be successful in my lifetime, but I'm looking 30 years ahead, and people say that's ridiculous. No, it isn't, because 50 years ago, I started speaking about why the U.S. needs to get out of the United Nations, and didn't get much positive feedback on that. But now when I speak about that, 30% of the audience is all excited, and 50% or more are listening and ready to figure out why. In fact, I talked to Massey Campos the other night about he could add that in, comparing the Constitution to the UN Charter, and we talked about how to do that. So, okay, so this is a long-term project that people are going to say is either stupid, or they disagree with, or it just can't be done. And this is what I'm passing out. And this is really something that a person might choose not to do simply because of their preference. And this all depends on yourself and what you feel, what your own intentions are as a person, what your religious inclination is. But as I explain on the back, as I was updating so-called end-of-life forms, you know, you do that when you get over 70, I realized, typo? Well, this is a true-false.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I realized that there wasn't something there to protect them for something that bothered me. For example, suppose my body was found with a knife in its back on the streets of Worcester. What's going to happen? After I'm identified and it goes through the process, they're going to do an autopsy, even though it's obvious that the knife in the back was the way you were killed. Personally, and you can even say religiously, I don't want my body to be desecrated by anybody for any reason after I'm gone. That's why I never signed a form to donate my body to science, where they have, you know, bodies, they can encourage people to donate your body before it's cremated or whatever, and then 2 medical students carve it up. Yeah, that's good, it's fine if you want to do that, and a lot of people who do. I applaud you if you want to contribute to anatomical education for people in medical programs, but I choose just not to do that. Also, I've never signed an organ donor form, and I think that's a great thing. People contribute your corneas or your kidney or whatever else is viable, your heart, your lungs. I just choose not to do it. And the basic principle of libertarianism is that you own your own body. And you can easily justify that by going back to 2 of the 10 commandments, or just from a rational, logical point of view. So I think every person in America should have a right to own their own body, do what they want with it, not have somebody else force you to do what you want, like be in the military if you don't want, do hospital service if you don't want.
Well, it's also a Fourth Amendment rights.
Right,
You're
exactly.
in your own person.
Exactly, but we haven't emphasized that enough. And what happens today, if somebody dies from strange circumstances or violent circumstances, you're going to find that the government forces itself into a mandatory autopsy. And the person doesn't have any choice, and I think that's an extreme violation of civil rights. So I made up this form that a person can fill out, and it's mass consistent with the number of witnesses you need and the kind of language. And this would be just like a will, and you'd file it with your will, keep it with your will, whatever. And if you died and the district attorney wanted to do an autopsy, your executor would say, wait a minute, I got his will and I have this form here. You can't do the autopsy because he didn't want it.
It's also like a healthcare proxy.
Yeah, like a healthcare proxy.
Don't,
you know,
do
like
not
a will.
resuscitate
Yep.
thing. Right.
But
Yes, that's a stupid thing too. When you are ready to go to resuscitate.
you decide. Yeah.
Exactly.
But the thing is that the government should not have the right to have that decision. That should be the individual's right. We're not going to get this right established for us in, I believe, at least 30 years of work. So they're going to violate your body whether you want it or not. But I think we have to start speaking up now, and we have to spread the idea. And so I'm encouraging people to think about it And it's a very simple thing if anybody wants to file that and keep it with the will, even though your next of kin won't be able to enforce it in the near future. And so I'm going to be promoting this and debating people about it, not just for this itself, but also for the general idea of you own your own body, because we need good reasons why the government shouldn't be able to conscript people into the military, why it shouldn't be able to inter you in the FEMA camps or anything else. So we have to promote this right, and this is a very simple way to do it, but it's a long-term project. So the people who say that it's stupid, I say, okay, have your opinion, but that's how we get things done in the long term.
Who has told you it was stupid? Or
Oh.
maybe, I don't need to know who, but why did they tell you it was stupid?
Because we won't be successful in enforcing it in the near future. So therefore it's a waste of time. Just like
That's a
50
tactic,
years ago,
though.
it was a waste of time to talk about getting out of the United Nations, supposedly. But now more people recognize it. Okay, that's the first 10-minute spiel. And, you know, it's a good thing to think about even for people who would want to have an autopsy. Justice Scalia's family didn't want to have one. He probably didn't want to have one. There was a little question there, although his health had some risks. And that was certainly an important issue. So I think that every citizen should have that right too.
On
The next
the
thing,
flip side, there have been suspicious deaths that the government wants to cover up.
That's
and,
right.
And they don't do an autopsy; they do an immediate cremation against the
Absolutely.
Against the will of the
family's
people,
will.
right?
but you could also, of course, have a declaration to go with your will that you wanted to have an autopsy. It should be the individual's choice. And somebody says, well, when you're dead, what, you know, you don't own it anymore. Wait a minute. If you can have a will to give your possessions to somebody, your body is your primary possession, so you should be able to.
Yeah, if I die by suicide and a gunshot in the back of my in my back, I mean, obviously that should.
Right.
I want an autopsy.
But it's up to you ahead of time, and it's up to your remaining family to enforce. Okay, so anyhow, that's a 30-year project. Now, this next one. Another basic tenet of libertarianism is everybody's created equal. You have no choice what your skin color is when you're born or what your ethnicity is. Okay, so I have a slogan that racism, individual racism is bad, institutional racism is worse, and governmental racism is the worst of all. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is I disagree with people who put racism into the category of discrimination and use the two terms absolutely equally. I think discrimination, in many cases, can be good. We discriminate when we choose what food we want, or who we think we might want to marry in the future, or whatever. That's an individual choice. Even somebody who has, let's say, a business and decides they want to discriminate and not allow, let's say, women into the business to come into the store and do something. If it's their property, I think they have a right to do that, even though I find it obnoxious, and I would vote with my feet the other way. And that's certainly true with racism. If I had a business, I wouldn't discriminate against people because of their skin color or their ethnicity or something else. But I think it's bad that we're being forced into looking at that as being as equal to other things. I think if somebody is individually a racist, we vote with our feet and with other ways. Worse than that, though, is institutional racism. If you don't get to go to a college because of your skin color or your ethnicity, and they want to have a quota of how many others of each type there are, I think that's far worse than the person who says, hey, wait a minute, I got an antique store and I only let Chinese people and everybody else is excluded. That's obnoxious, but the school keeping you out because of your race or whatever is worse. Worst of all is when the government does it. Now, there's a lot of ways that the government is very racist. The census form, which is valid for keeping track of how many people and things like that, has racist questions on it. If you remember the 2010, there were checkoff things. I think it's absolutely wrong to allow the government to have racial questions on the census form. People say, oh, we needed to study the demographics. I say, If we needed to study the demographics, let people do that voluntary, and then people can buy those reports. But the government shouldn't be doing any racial demographics of any sort, any busing of children from one school to another because of their color or race. Okay, so what do I come across? This form here is the first page of the form that somebody has to fill out when you buy a firearms at a gun store. It's the federal firearms form, the so-called background check or whatever that deals with it. And, you know, there's a question of whether we should really have that or not anyway. After all, this is always bring stones. After all, the Second Amendment says shall not be infringed. And some people just leave it at that and say shall not be infringed, so therefore just keep it that strong. But I think there's little things we can do. On this one, you'll notice the federal government insists, it's not just asking, but it insists that a person put down their race in order to buy a firearm. Well, not only does the Second Amendment say shall not be infringed, but the federal government or any other government shouldn't be keeping track of people by race. An interesting thing about this is several years ago, the form was slightly different, and there actually was a blank line for other. And if I bought a gun where it said race, I always put down either American, human, or GFY. And they don't have that anymore. They probably did that in response to people like me. And so the government wants to track people by race, and I think that's an extremely dangerous thing. Now here's the point, this is an action thing too, just like the Declaration of Body Ownership can be an action thing if somebody wants to do that. This is an action item too. President Trump. I'm not a big fan of President Trump. I'm willing to give him credit for things he does right. I'm also willing to criticize for things he does wrong. He's a functionalist. He'll do some things right when he thinks it's in the interest of himself or the country. But as Ron Paul said, he doesn't really have a philosophy of governance. So, is that good or is that bad? Well, it can be good. We can take advantage of that. And actually, you have a chance of convincing President Trump to do some good things. You had zero chance with Obama of convincing him to do any good things. I think most of us recognize that. But with Trump, even if you don't like him, even if he does some bad things, we can convince him to do some good things. Now, I'm not a big fan of some of his appointments. I think they're better than the previous several administrations, but even Neil Gorsuch, the new Supreme Court Justice, who was the best of the 20 on the list, even he is somebody that I wouldn't have put on my list because he was a member of the CFR at one point. So, my criticism of Trump aside, he has done some good things, and Gorsuch was better than what anybody else probably would have done from the Democratic side. And he did a lot of, so far, he's done a lot of the executive orders. And the news media is always doing Trump Russia, Trump Russia, Trump Russia, so we're not really hearing much about the executive orders. But here's something that can actually be fixed by executive order. The Justice Department runs the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and that's under the total realm of the president in the end run. So he could issue an executive order to tell the Bureau of ATFE, or whatever they call it, to drop the racial question on these forms. There is a presidential commission on the Second Amendment with about 50 or 60 members that have been appointed, although they've been pretty quiet about it. And that commission is supposedly going to suggest things regarding the Second Amendment and firearms to President Trump. One of the members on that commission is Chris Cox, the director of the National Rifle Association Institute of Legislative Affairs, NRA-ILA. So, one thing that people could do is contact Chris Cox either in writing or by email and say, when you're on this commission, let's get rid of the racism on the federal form. He may not be big on that, he may not care a whit about it, but maybe he does. There's a congressman named Tom Emmer, E-M-M-E-R, from Minnesota, who's also on that commission. So people could write to him and show a copy of this and say, look, the government shouldn't be racist. how about your commission get President Trump to do an executive order? I don't know that I can spread the word enough and get enough people on board to get that done. But if we can get enough people encouraging that, that's something that Trump might do. He well might do it. That would be effective. Whereas Obama or some of the other ones would never do something like that. So I'm going to be encouraging people to write to their congressman, to write to Congressman Emmer, E-M-M-E-R, and to write to the NRA, to Chris Cox, who's in charge of the ILA, and say, hey, you guys on this presidential commission, let's get an executive order done that repeals this little bit of government racism. And then maybe we can attack the census and we can attack the other things. Getting back to Justice Scalia, his death was very unfortunate because we would have had a 5-4 decision in the Abigail Fisher case. She was denied entry to a medical school. I always forget if it was Texas or Michigan, because she was white, and they wanted to have a racial quota of white and non-white, and that's exactly the type of government racism that I'm talking about. Justice Scalia would have voted to stop that. Unfortunately, he didn't, so the 4-4 decision allows that racism to stand until somebody else is damaged by that and goes through the whole process and gets to the Supreme Court again. But we can attack the racism in other ways, and I think this is the simplest way that has a chance. Now, about 7 miles up the road in Barrie a month ago, I went to one of the show and tell meetings by our Congressman, James Fidel McGovern. And I talked to him about this exactly, and believe it or not, when I went through the rational explanation that, you know, this is racism and the government shouldn't be keeping track of race, his set was, well, gee, we really don't need to do it because there's a picture ID on things. And I suggested that, you know, he'd talk to others about it. He said he'd look into it, and he was not unfavorable to it. So even writing a letter to Jim McGovern might have some effect. And if we could get some of the congressmen on board who might normally on our side, that would help. So I think we have a chance of getting this pushed through by executive order, but only if we can get ultimately enough people within the next year to understand the issue and do it. So I'll be presenting that and see if people pick up the ball. If they don't, at least it gives a little bit of education on that.
Now, if you're looking to have this done by executive order, then what good is contacting Jim McGovern about
Because
this?
the congressional committee has other congressmen too, and he might influence some of them.
And executive order is influenced by congressional committee?
It can be if they influence a commission that's reporting to the president. This commission on the Second Amendment is going to be reporting directly to the president with action suggestions. If they reported to him and one of their action suggestions was to strike this from firearms reforms, my bet is that Trump would do it.
But Jim McGovern's not part of that.
No, he's not part of that commission.
Right. So I'm still kind of missing why contacting Jim McGovern. It sounds like it doesn't have much of a.
Well, no,
kind of
it sounds like
helpful.
if you get enough people, whether you're on a congressional delegation or not, if you get enough backers in Congress to say this is a good idea,
Okay.
it adds fuel to the fire. It adds more convincibility for the president to say, all right, I'll go ahead and do this.
Yeah, they do all have lunch together and stuff.
The key one to
Yeah,
contact
Tom.
is Tom Emmer, E-M-M-E-R, from Minnesota, because he's on
Yeah.
the commission. And the reason why McGovern or some of the other clowns in the state would be good to be put on notice and see if they might even say, oh, yeah, you kind of got a point, is because if they're talking to him at some point, he might feel more empowered to get the commission
Well,
to do
especially
this.
if you can get a Democrat like McGovern to say it's a good idea.
Yeah.
because That's who you would expect to find
Right, and
opposition
the
from.
Democrats are so vulnerable to this because they're the biggest racist of any of the parties. And, you know, any decent Democrat would want to take a shot and say, oh, here's a place where I'm peeling back racism. But, of course, it's true, there's a lot of the Republicans who voted for affirmative action or this kind of nonsense too that we need to work on. But anyway, those are my
It's a
two.
talking point, just like we use Jim McGovern as a talking point all the time too. It's not that he can pass a resolution in the city council, but it helps to be able to say Jim McGovern supports this.
Right. And so people are going to say, yeah, you know, the one on the firearms thing, you're not going to get enough people to do it, so it isn't going to work. And they're going to say, give me a break. You're never going to get a right to have your own body post-mortem be protected from autopsy because the government has a special interest in it. Well, I don't think the government's interest should ever
curious.
trump the individual.
I'm curious why you think that's a fight worth. You're dead at that point, so why should we care what happens to our body?
Well, see,
after?
that's an individual decision.
Yeah.
And I respect everybody's individual religious beliefs. And some people have a religious belief that they own their own body from the moment of becoming a human, whenever that is,
Right.
up until the end and beyond the end. And they don't want other
And
people.
some people are superstitious too. They think that
Some are.
if they give up their body, then they'll have nothing to live in their next incarnation.
That may be. And I respect that opinion, but I think it's a fundamental right that everybody gets to make that choice instead of another group of people, and worst of all,
Well, there's
the
a
government.
principle at stake, and it's to me it's similar to the suicide question. I think we should repeal all suicide laws because that goes to that very issue.
Yeah, that's a
Right.
private issue too.
Self-ownership.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And they base a lot of their bullshit laws on the idea that they have a stake in your health and your well-being.
Exactly.
So once they say you can't kill yourself, well, now they can. That's Pandora's box of the
They
rest
can
of
open
your
the door
rights.
to anything else.
Yeah.
You
We
can't
now we
take
can
the-
tell you what to eat, what not to eat.
You can't take this medication,
It's
or
not a
you
freedom
have
issue.
to take this
Right, because
medication.
the state has
Or-
a compelling interest in your life.
Mandatory vaccinations.
Mandatory vaccinations, right?
This helps reinforce defense against that.
And,
too.
and before you go on, I know that Jews and Muslims together, you have to be buried before sundown. So what time do you have to do an autopsy, especially if a crime has occurred? You know how the law enforcement, it's a very slow process. I get it. They want to make sure they dot all the I's and cross all the T's. But if you're Jewish or Muslim, you've got to be interred by sundown. If you're murdered at 4 in the afternoon, how much time does that give the state to... And here's the thing, is that the state would respect that because they don't want to be seen as racist.
They might, but
They might,
if
right.
they're going to respect that, they should also respect other reasons that an individual would have.
Certainly.
And it relates to all the other issues of individual self-ownership, like the government shouldn't have a right to say you've got to be in the military, you've got to eat the food we give you, get the shots you want, live where we tell you. And they say, but if you don't want to shoot somebody, you can be in the medical corps. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. Or you get all these people who are opposed to military conscription, but then they say, oh, everybody should do 2 years of public service. Well, no, that's just as bad.
Yeah.
If you are forced to do public service against your will. You know, you own your own body. You have a right to your own property. You have to respect others' individual rights and ownership and not violate them.
What's the 11th Amendment say? Isn't that the thing about servitude? Involuntary servitude, isn't that directly unconstitutional?
It's supposed to be, but that argument hasn't won the day yet in military conscription things.
Well, just issuing a social security card. You didn't get a social security card until you had your first job. Well, now it's mandated that
From
a
birth.
newborn.
Yeah.
So it's like, why? I think a social security card is the government's declaration that you are now my property.
And
Exactly,
you know,
sure.
an interesting thing
Right.
about that in police work today, most police are trained that the police have on their side of the law the right to identify a person like at a scene of a crime or almost anywhere. And so you, under the law, must identify yourself to a policeman. But in Massachusetts law, it doesn't say that you have to identify yourself by showing a driving license or a hunting license or a birth certificate or anything. It just says you have to say who you are and maybe where you live, and that's it. Today, most police are trained to get the social security number of the person when they write down the identification. And whenever I go into a bank and have to legitimately use the Social
you don't
Security
have to
number, I take, well, for a financial account.
No, but I'm saying if a cop asks you.
No, I don't. I tell them I refuse to memorize the Social Security number. And you have a right to identify who I am by me saying who I am. And absent probable cause, you have no right for any other identification. That's going to be harder to win the argument on in the future because more and more police are being trained. They want to get your Social Security number too and see your driving license. And so the day will come when somebody legitimately declines to do that, they will be improperly arrested. So we have to fight back on a number of issues. So I think everything we can do to rebuild the idea that you own your own body and the government doesn't have a right to it is another grain in the sand of the beach to stop the oppression that we're probably going to succumb to and live under for the next 400 years. That doesn't mean I'm going to give up.
You know, that's the same way I feel. It may be bleak, but I don't roll over. I'd rather go down fighting.
It's very interesting that you talked about IDs and licensing. And Sharon, you mentioned about Social Security. Your second question here, there should be no military draft or selective service registration requirement for American citizens. I listen to WTAG talk radio all the time, and you hear the ads all the time. Oh, child at 18 has 30 days to selective service. And I remember back during the Reagan years when that was reinstituted.
It was actually Carter that did it.
Right, Carter, but I turned 18 during the Reagan years, so moot argument. But I remember I was like, okay, I got to do it, and I always feared that I'll be registered for the draft or whatever. But now that I'm older and I've never had to do that, I actually volunteered to serve with Homeland Security after 9/11. I hear these ads, and I think to myself, it's just like what you said. We have our Social Security cards. We have to get a driver's license. We have to sign up for this. We have to show ID. We're ID'd up the wazoo here.
Except for voting.
Right, except for voting. So why do we have to sign up for this additional thing in order to get our government loans, get our student loans? Because that's what the ad says.
Frankly,
well, you'll be denied your student loan if you don't sign up.
I advise young men to refuse to do it. They're mostly afraid not to.
Sure.
I advise, say, right, okay.
And I remember when I was 18, I was afraid. I was like, and everybody was like, no, you got to do this. I was like, okay. I was 18. I was a stupid kid. But now that I'm an old man, I think to myself, we're ID'd up the wazoo. Why do we need to sign up for this additional thing?
Right.
What is it? What does it do?
And by the way, I want to point out, if anybody else sees this, that's on a candidate survey form that's a true-false question that I use anytime I meet a new candidate to find out if I want to support them. There's 15 questions there. I expect them to get 12 right to get my help at all. 12 right out of the true-false. And I can get along with not agreeing with somebody on every issue. But if some candidate hands that back to me and he's got 8 or 9 wrong out of 15, goodbye. I'm not even going to vote for you.
That's not the guy we want, or woman we want, right?
Yeah. So I was thinking there were 3 candidates who might have been here today, so that's why I brought that along. And I will be giving that to anybody who's a candidate for office. Some of them get 15 out of 15 right. They're good, solid people. Others get 12, 13, 14. That's fine.
Now, do you have any reservations about using the word libertarian?
No.
Especially the capital L?
No.
Because that will alienate a lot of people who don't see themselves.
Well, then they can reduce it to a small L if they want.
That's what part of being a libertarian is. If you don't agree with it, you
I'm
can
both.
do it.
And I have no objection to people who are small L but don't want to have anything to do with the capital L party, because all political parties are dysfunctional. Look what happened in the 2016 election.
Right.
We had 2 of the most unpopular people running in the Republican and Democratic primary parties. And the reason Hillary Clinton lost, above all else, was she was just so much more repugnant than Donald Trump. A lot of people picked Donald Trump when their favorite candidate among the Republicans didn't win, and they thought, well, better than not. And I understand the compromise
thing.
thing.
On the Democrat side,
right.
A lot of people would have, on the Democrat side, would have preferred Bernie, but they they got stuck with
somebody,
Hillary.
Martin,
Right, that's because of that.
But I know where his story's going to go. Keep going about the
so
Bill Weld
anyway,
thing. Right.
I understand if people picked Trump and supported him, obviously far better than Madam Mao, no doubt about that. And that's why he won, because otherwise, if the Republicans had, if the Democrats had somebody who wasn't as totally obnoxious and evil as Madam Mao, the Democrats would have won. Trump wouldn't have won. He wasn't the kind of candidate who could put up a good enough persona for a lot of the average people. But here's what happened. So I didn't like the choices that there were. Donald Trump, not philosophically solid. Yes, he's a functionalist. We can get him to do some things right. Let's get to it now that he's in there. Hillary Clinton, can't imagine anybody worse unless it's Elizabeth Warren. So obviously I'm going to vote for a so-called third party or minor party candidate. Well, in the 50 states, the only other party that was on the ballot in all 50 states was the Libertarian Party, and I've been part of the Libertarian Party. In fact, I could have been a delegate to the convention that chose the candidates for the Libertarian Party. I decided not to. I figured I could spend the $1,000 that I would have spent going to Orlando, doing all that kind of work, because I felt that we would get a good candidate for president, and the candidates for vice president were all suitable. In fact, one of them is absolutely fantastic, a guy named Larry Sharp. If you ever get a chance to see him or meet him, by all means, go see Larry Sharp. So what happens? About 2 weeks before the party convention, where we're going to choose most likely Gary Johnson, who's a friend of mine from 4 years ago, even though he's faded now on a number of issues and I'm not too pleased with him. About 2 weeks before the convention, the establishment pulled off a sneaky thing. They had been looking all along at could they take over one of the parties, like the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or the Constitution Party, if they didn't like the options from the Republican and Democratic Party. They quickly realized that they weren't going to be able to take over the Libertarian Party and put in an establishment candidate for president. It would have either been Gary Johnson or Austin Peterson or John McAfee or somebody else, not an establishment person. But 2 weeks before that, they pulled a very sneaky trick, and they had William Weld become a member of the Libertarian Party and declare that he was a vice presidential candidate, and that the idea was, having two former governors, former Republicans who aren't satisfied with the Republican Party being candidates would draw a lot of people in and build the numbers and strengthen the party. Well, a lot of us argued against that. I could only do it by conference call and stuff. And we didn't carry the day, and William Weld ended up getting the nomination for lieutenant governor on the second ballot. Too many people caved, including 6 out of our 9 people from Massachusetts who went to the convention. So we get a CFR establishment jerk as a vice presidential candidate. I would never vote